My name is Judge Ruth Kraft, and contrary to what you just heard about settlement talks, I was a judge for 14 years and retired from the New York court system. And I'm now in private practice in the area of employment law. I just want to give general instructions. We're going to turn on the timers. The team will have 30 minutes to make its presentation. We'll then reset the timers for a 20-minute Q&A period. After the Q&A is over, we will go over the, we'll give you around 10 minutes of feedback on
fantastic,
on the presentations, etc. You're all advancing tomorrow into the 10-minute round and the 90-second round.
Yes.
So, does everybody among the judges have one of these? Yes, very good. Okay. I just want to give some instructions to the judges as well. Obviously, these get filled out at the conclusion of the session. At the beginning of the presentation, you're going to need to identify who we are, whether we're a board, a customer of yours, the general public, etc., so that we know the roles that we're going to play.
Okay.
In the Q&A, it's very important that we stay in the roles that they've assigned us, not in our real life roles. And so they're going to set the stage for the role that we assume. The question should really be directed more to the ethical element than to anything else, the legal or the economic or managerial elements, because this is a business ethics case competition in its essence, although they're going to be laying the foundation, as we say in court. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have to take this actually. Hello? I'm in a meeting. Is it okay?
Yeah.
That's right.
I'm taking it around. I'll call you back. Yes, absolutely. Okay, done deal. Okay.
She did that on the bench, too, so don't worry about it.
This goes on all the time in court at the bench. Everybody has their cell phones out. Everyone has their iPads or beepers. I have friends who are texting under the bench like this all day long. As a matter of fact, they're still judges, and they text me, how do I decide the case? Or there's a motion, what do I do? Or in my tax cases, I can't figure out the numbers. Can I email you and you'll tell me what the answer is? Happens all the time. Okay, so those are the questions. So we need to stick to the ethics in the questions, and to stay on roll. Those are my big instructions to you. Super intelligent people. I don't think they need more, unlike litigants who've appeared before me. All right. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, first the judges, is to introduce yourselves.
I'm Gail Smith. I'm the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer for Booz Allen Hamilton.
I'm Bruce Anderson. I'm the Chief Ethics Officer for Health.
I do.
Cheyenne Ross, Vice President of Compliance and Regulatory Affairs at Bridgeway Health Solutions.
Okay. And we're going to get started with the clocks. I'm going to give you the I know we probably would have averted because it likes to do that. I'm going to give you the one with the larger display. You can decide who's going to hold it. I'll call time in 5 minutes just in case.
Okay.
So there's yours.
I think if we could maybe just leave it on the table so that somebody can see it.
Is it already started? That's good.
Yes, it's just started, but don't worry.
Okay, so we should just start right now.
Yeah.
That's right. 3%.
There you go.
All right. Well, hello everybody. My name is Michaela Young, and I'm from the team from the University of Florida. And we'd like to thank all of you, the AOL Board of Directors, for being here and for considering our solution to the problem that we're about to introduce to you. I'm just going to be speaking for a few minutes, setting the stage for the issue, our proposed solutions, and just the way that it's going to be discussed before the rest of my team goes a bit more in depth. If you take a look at the quote behind me, this is how AOL CEO Tim Armstrong chose to address changes that were going to be made to employee 401k plans to his employees by essentially blaming, quote, distressed babies who were born to members of the AOL family and the healthcare costs associated with the care for those children for the fact that he was going to be making these changes, which essentially was placing the blame for this corporate decision on the most vulnerable members of the AOL community. Now, just to take a moment and go through how we're going to be presenting this issue and our proposed solutions to you all. First of all, we need to address the fact that there were essentially two issues that arose from the situation. Firstly, was the change in 401k contribution plans that was proposed by Tim Armstrong, which would be switching from monthly 401k contributions to an annual lump sum 401k contribution for employees. The second issue that arose was the speech itself that he gave, and the fact that the announcement and justification of changes was highly controversial. We're going to address both of these issues in the context of the legal environment that AOL is currently functioning in, and address the circumstances in which CEO Tim Armstrong felt compelled to make the actions that he did. We're then going to go into the financial implications of both of the issues, both the indirect and direct financial implications. And lastly, but certainly not least, the importance of ethical leadership, which we believe is the main solution to this problem and is what is going to be the key to AOL moving forward and continuing to be successful. Now, just continuing to set the stage, a bit of background information on AOL as a company. It was founded in 1983 as Control Video Corporation and is best known for its AOL online software suite, which was very popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. Tim Armstrong entered the scene as CEO in 2009 and immediately rebranded AOL as a brand company, the most famous of their acquisitions being that of Huffington Post in 2011. Their mission statement is as follows. Our world-class team of artists and innovators is on a mission to inform, entertain, and connect. And these three goals are what have carried AOL through times of immense success and also times of trials and tribulations. And these are the goals that we want to keep in mind with all of AOL's actions moving forward from this point. Now, to briefly address the benefits program that was in place at AOL. First of all, AOL had what was called a self-insured corporate plan, which can be used in any situation where the costs that are likely to be incurred can be calculated and accounted for, and that money can be saved so that when the costs are incurred, it's there and they can be paid for. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, as employees are contributing to the self-insurance plan and AOL is in turn contributing to the healthcare reservoir available for the employees, there are things that come up as the AOL employees are aging and as people have children. There are costs that are going to come up that could exceed what AOL has accounted for previously, which is where stop-loss insurance comes into place. It does exactly what the name sounds like and functions similarly to a deductible for a personal plan, essentially setting a cap for what AOL would have to pay for any employee, and then the company that the stop-loss insurance was purchased through will handle anything over that cap. Now, AOL opened itself up to a lot of risk by having a relatively high cap. Most companies of this size have a cap that's between $250,000 and $500,000. But as we can infer by the speech that Armstrong made, saying that $1 million was paid for each of the, quote, distressed babies in question, we can assume that they had a $1 million stop-loss insurance cap, which opens the company up to a lot of risk. Now, AOL certainly did have the cash to cover this risk, but although they have a young workforce, that workforce is aging. And as people get older and things come up, this is opening the company up to a lot of risk. And if that risk is left unmitigated, this could cause a huge problem for AOL in the future. And now, it's not just the age of the employees at AOL that's changing. The entire situation surrounding corporate healthcare in America is changing right now as well. The tradition into Obamacare, formerly known as the Affordable Care Act, is not uncomplicated to say the least. A lot of the regulations surrounding changes that are going to be made in the future, the implications are not completely understood yet, and that's something that's going to have to be looked at moving forward as their implications are better understood. But it's certainly something that needs to be kept in mind for AOL and the fact that they're going to need to account for those regulations and additional costs. Also, to an extent, we think that poor financial planning is responsible for the fact that AOL felt it was necessary to change contribution plans to employee retirement benefits in order to compensate for healthcare costs that they were incurring as well. Now, just to reiterate, Armstrong's decision essentially boils down to the two issues that were stated earlier: the changes to the 401k contribution plans and the justification and announcement of those changes in itself. And this is where the controversy comes from that's going to be the source of discussion for the rest of our presentation. Now, in order to better explain the legal environment surrounding this issue is my teammate, Katie.
Hello, my name is Katie Wiley, and I'm going to be here to discuss the legal environment in which AOL is functioning in. So first first I want to do a brief history of benefits in the United States and our legal system. Benefits really date all the way back to World War II, when companies wanted to pay their employees more wages but didn't have the cash on hand. So they began offering them wages in other forms, such as benefits, and further into retirement plans. And so as we move forward in time, we become familiar with the defined benefit type of retirement plan, where companies, upon retirement, pay an employee a specified amount per month that is based on an internal formula inside the company. And as time further moved along, we moved to defined contributions, which is what we're familiar with now, where an employee and an employer make specific contributions into an individually held account, and there are no more future payments. This is the only payment the employer makes. There are no more future payments like in defined benefit programs. But now our environment is changing even further. And so when Tim Armstrong decides to change the benefit package that he has, he's making this change based on outside forces. And the outside force that is really driving this change is the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act was passed into law on March 23rd, 2010, and is something that employers cannot afford to overlook. It does not matter where you fall on the issue. That is not something we're here to discuss, but it will raise costs for employers who want to provide health insurance for employees. It's inevitable. Let me paint a picture for you. There's a male, 22 years old, goes to work for a company, and his company wants to give him health insurance. Well, previously, a 22-year-old male wouldn't have many health costs, correct? And so now his employer cannot charge him more than 9.5% of his total salary, and has to cover over 60% of his has to cover at least 60% of his cost under the Affordable Care Act. So this is driving up the cost for people, or for employers who want to offer health insurance. And so with this, Tim Armstrong realizes that these costs are going up and he can't avoid them. So he decides to change the retirement plan from a 401k monthly matching program to a 401k lump sum program. And under the IRS reporting requirements, this is perfectly legal. And I want to take a moment to point out that benefits in the United States is something that is very ubiquitous. We can agree that almost every company offers some form of benefit package. And it's something that we've almost come to understand as an entitlement, or as something that we would obviously, we would have if we go to work for a company. But this is not a legal mandate in our system. It is purely out of a company's goodwill and out of their intent to retain employees. And so now we move to the fact that AOL is a self-insured company. And being self-insured, you take on more responsibility in the United States legal system. You are legally held responsible for infractions under certain acts. And so I want to look at the history of protecting privacy in the United States. The history of protecting privacy really dates all the way back to the Bill of Rights and some of the acts in there, listed there. But some of the other acts as we move throughout time that we have are the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which I will refer to from here on out as HIPAA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, the American Disabilities Act, and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. I have all of these listed here just to show the breadth of privacy that we do strive to protect in our country. And so with his speech, did he violate any of these acts that I have listed here that choose to protect privacy? And the act that we can look at and say maybe he did is indeed HIPAA. And HIPAA really works to kind of denote some of the reporting requirements from a self-insured company and what you can report, how you can report it, but it also has a section of what you are allowed to say, actually verbally say out loud. And that information is known as private healthcare information, and that's informally described in the bill as individually identifiable health information and or protected health information. And so with his speech, the distressed babies, one might say, well, that indeed sounds like individually identifiable health information, and HIPAA does strive to protect people under 18 as well as everyone else that a company represents. And so the question, did Tim Armstrong violate HIPAA? The answer is no. He did not disclose any of the information. As we can see from the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 164, we can see the standard identifiers for private healthcare information, and he did not disclose any of this information, name, addresses. I have all of this so that you can see, indeed, none of this information was violated. And so that leads us to the question that while the legal standards were satisfied, did Tim Armstrong satisfy his stakeholders, and did he set them up for success? And my team would argue no. And further to discuss this is my teammate Xavier.
Thank you, Katie. Well, first we have established the legal implications of the legal environment regarding this decision made by Tim Armstrong. As Katie stated, I'm going to look at the financial implications. I'm going to look at the direct financial implications, that is more firm related, and the indirect, which is more towards the employees and the change of the retirement plan. So let me start with the direct cost of healthcare. As it was stated under the new legislation for healthcare, healthcare costs cannot exceed 9.5% of the employee's salary. If it exceeds this amount, then the employer is going to have to pay an amount in fines in order to match this. And obviously, this is going to add more to the healthcare expenses of the company, which will, in the end, add to the bottom line. And it will increase employer contributions to healthcare coverage. So now that I've talked about the firm direct costs, I wanted to switch to the indirect ones. And I want to talk about the employees and how this change into the retirement plan affects them and their family. Well, first I want to set the background as what kind of distribution plans are present in the United States when it comes to retirement. You have the periodic one, which is, as it said, just monthly payments that is made by the employer. And you have the non-periodic one, which we call it the lump sum distributions, which is usually made at the end of the year for that fiscal year. And then it's actually been pretty used by companies in Wall Street and other tech companies, as some of them have already switched to some plan. So since AOL was switching to the lump sum, then we can also have that this drag on to other perception-driven costs. The first one is that obviously unhappy employees are going to be likely to stay by the end of the year, and no firm wants people who don't feel comfortable in the space that they're working. So this is going to drive into low job satisfaction. Productivity obviously might be jeopardized, and this could translate into other decrease in the company's perception, as we will see with negative publicity and the lack of trust and leadership from the employees to the employers to the officers. And as we can see, this is not, I'm not saying that this is specifically correlated to him making a speech and the price of stock going down, but it is worth to take a look of that in February 9, when the Stress Baby speech was made, AOL stock was trading on $45.75. And after that, it went down, it reached its lowest on February 19 to $43.37, which was the lowest price it ever had in February. So this is something that we can see all the feedback that it got from the market as making this announcement, which was a negative thing. And more directly, how does this impact the employees? Well, first, if they leave the company before that payment is made, then they lose. 401k plans become less convenient, and this is something that will make the tech industry very vulnerable because they have high turnover rates. So all these employees will be losing on all that payment that could be made. On top of that, we have what we call the bear market trap, which will be that they don't know if at the time that money is invested is going to be a good time. But it might be a down market, it might be a good market. They could lose all those gains that could have been done if it was made up month before. So this is obviously something that is not going to add to the well-being of these employees. And directing to that, they will lose on any compound interest because money is not going to be earned on money because it's just one lump sum payment made at the end of the year. So as we can see, AOL choose to carry more risks. They choose to carry more responsibilities. But they choose to do so by channeling through the employees. And in order to talk about what ethical leadership is and how important it is, I'm going to have my colleague Terry explain to you what it is to be an ethical leader. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry Frederick, and today I'll be discussing the core ethical component of our presentation today, which is centered around ethical leadership. Now, I want to make it clear that we're not here to demonize Mr. Tim Armstrong, but what we are here to do is to evaluate his actions within the context of a larger framework that we'd like to call ethical leadership. But before we talk about ethical leadership, we need to make it clear differences between management and leadership, because Tim Armstrong is arguably a very good manager. Management deals with coping with complexity, maximizing efficiency, cutting costs, planning, organizing, controlling the day-to-day functions of an organization, and mitigating and lowering costs. But leadership, on the other hand, deals with establishing a vision and how you go about aligning and motivating and bring your followers to reach that vision. So fundamental to that is coping with change. And we can see that the way that Tim Armstrong has been coping with change is questionable at best. My colleagues did a great job at explaining the fronts in which Tim Armstrong is having to deal with change, both external and internal. external in the sense that he has to deal with the Affordable Care Act, which is something that many CEOs have to deal with because they have to reevaluate how they implement healthcare in their businesses. And internal in the way that he made the speech and he has his backlash from his employees and he has to deal with changing the 401k plan on an internal front. So the word that we would use to describe how he's choosing to deal with these changes is reactive. And whenever we see that someone is acting from a reactive standpoint, that indicates a problem. And we're here to propose to you all a solution to that problem. And that is ethical leadership. So ethical leadership deals with providing value for all stakeholders in the company instead of just looking at short-sighted profit. It deals with, first, fundamentally respecting the persons and pursuing intelligent self-interest, not just short-term profit. And when we say respecting the persons, that's very important. It's something that's very overlooked today in corporate America, how important it is to respect the persons in transactions. People tend to fail to realize that without respect and trust, transactions cannot occur. In fact, the free market is a fundamentally ethical market. Without trust and respect, free market can't happen. And we need to go back to emphasizing that as a company. So respecting the persons means realizing that every stakeholder has a face, has a family, and has particular needs. And when you go about making decisions for the company, you need to address that instead of just looking at one particular fragment of situation, just profits. And when we say pursuing intelligent self-interest, we mean, yes, it's okay to look at profit, but it's more important to look at it in the long term. So what does that look like to a company? An employee, it looks like less corruption, first of all, because now employees, they're not looking towards what's most profitable in the short term. They're looking at acting ethically and acting in accordance to the mission of the company, which leads to a longer social existence and we argue a longer financial existence because you, first of all, avoid scandal and you build trust and relationship with different industries and different customers in your industry. Now, when we talk about ethical leadership, we talk a lot about value, and I want to make it clear that when we say value, that's pretty ambiguous. We're not saying to avoid profit or not to work for profit, because profit is valuable. Profit is valuable for shareholders in particular, and shareholders are a major stakeholder in the company. But we're saying we shouldn't just look at shareholders, we need to look at the employees, we need to look at the employers, look at the customers. Everyone who has a stake in that company, we need to make sure we're providing value for that company. And what does that look like? Well, several major schools of thought regarding leadership make reference to this. They discuss, for example, servant leadership, serving your employees, making sure they're empowered so that they can return to the company or what you've given to them. When we talk about authentic leadership, we talk about leading with your values, your mission, which is alluding to values, not just short-term profits. And we talk about transformational leadership, we talk about motivating your employees, having one-on-one coaching with them, making sure they're empowered to make decisions from the company. All these leadership theories make reference towards furthering value instead of just one particular thing, which is what could be profit. But it's important to talk not just about what we can do as far as implementing leadership strategies, it's important to talk about character as well. And we're going to talk about Tim Armstrong's character as a CEO and leader of the company. So what we suggest is to focus on encouraging virtuous character for leaders in the company. And to do that, we're going to focus on Aristotle's virtue theory. And this is just a list of some virtues from the theory. So we have courage, liberality, magnanimity, truthfulness, and friendliness. And you can see clearly that when we evaluate Tim Armstrong's actions with regard to this chart, that he's usually operating from a state of deficiency or excess. Aristotle describes that a virtuous person is someone who acts in moderation. It's not too much of anything, it's not too little of anything. And we can see that Tim Armstrong, specifically the example about stressed babies, can be arguably acting from a state of cowardice. Instead of choosing to be accountable for what he could have done better as a leader in the company, he chose to place the blame on a population that has no control of the matter, which are babies. And for example, with liberality, which is how you choose to spend your money, Tim Armstrong is willing to accept these huge executive compensation packages, but he's willing to pass on these risks that his company has been incurring onto his employees, which suggests that he's not being very liberal with his money. He's not spending it very wisely, not being very virtuous with how the company is spending their money. So we just want to emphasize the fact that as a company, AOL needs to further virtuous character in their leader, as well as implement plans of ethical leadership, which focus on establishing value for all stakeholders in the long run. And to further elaborate on that is my colleague, Michaela.
Thank you, Terry. Now, stemming from what Terry began to discuss about virtue in our leaders, these are some of the recommendations that we have moving forward for what AOL should do in concerns to promoting ethical leadership and essentially fixing the media firestorm that was created around his speech and the proposed changes that he had made. First of all, and most basically, we really think that a sincere apology could go a very long way in mending his relationship not only with his employees, but with the public in general and their perception of that employee-employer relation that resulted from his speech. This actually has already happened. Tim Armstrong made a personal phone call to the mother of one of the babies who wrote a scathing response to his speech that went viral online. He made a personal phone call, and although the damage had, in a sense, already been done, this is certainly a step in the right direction and shows the sort of positive changes that we're looking for. Also, we would suggest reverting back to the periodic disbursements of retirement funds, at least for the time being. As we've discussed previously, there's nothing illegal with making a lump sum contribution at the end of the year, but because of the way that the change was presented to employees, the response was very negative. So although that change could potentially be made again in the future if it's the right move for AOL to make at that time, for right now, we would suggest reverting back to the monthly contributions, which has, in addition, already happened in the wake of Armstrong's speech. And finally, we'd like to implement a system of improved leadership training and evaluation. If you look at the visual that's on this slide, showing lawfulness, financial returns, organizational success, and ethical leadership at the core, all of these components of a successful company are incredibly important, but we would argue, and we don't think it's a stretch to argue, that without ethical leadership at the core of organizational decisions, a company will not be successful in the long run. So if ethical leadership is promoted throughout all components of corporate decision-making, AOL will have more success in the future and won't have these kinds of issues that need to be dealt with again. Now, as far as the leadership training and evaluation goes, we'd like to propose a three-pronged system that would include virtue development, communication, and employee feedback. As far as virtue development, it's very, very important that AOL CEO Tim Armstrong is operating in that average of meanness as opposed to an excess or deficiency. So there would be a training program implemented to make sure that these values were implemented better in the future. Communication, really, if you think back to the mission statement that we listed at the beginning, connectedness was the last of the three goals that was mentioned, and that's where we feel that the greatest failure was. There was a great breakdown in connectedness between employer and employee, between the company and the public perception of that company. So we would like to implement a system in which greater communication is present between the executive and his employees, which would be done, for the most part, through employee feedback, both formal and informal. As far as formal feedback goes, we would suggest annual reviews by the employees of their executive, Tim Armstrong, which would be submitted anonymously and would allow them to give this formal annual feedback and make sure that he was aware of the employee's perception of his actions. Also, on an informal level, we'd suggest the creation, perhaps, of an app that would allow employees to, again, anonymously submit suggestions, issues, and just general feedback to Tim Armstrong, which would then be filtered and passed along to the executive so that he could manage his employees' perception of himself. Now, as we conclude our presentation, we'd like to take a quote from the AOL Impact Program page, which was formed under Tim Armstrong's executive leadership in 2010. And it's a part of the company that's concerned with social presence and making sure that AOL, in addition to having its huge presence on the internet with all of its acquisitions, is managing that responsibly and also is able to do outreach to promote social goodness in the community. And the quote we took from this was, "We're doing good is part of the everyday conversation." And that's exactly the attitude that we think that AOL as a corporation and Tim Armstrong himself should have moving forward, and that will be to the best benefit of AOL. Now we are concluding our presentation. Thank you very much for your consideration of our solution, and we'll open the floor up to questions.
Okay, so wait a second, because now I have to clear this thing out. You finished with 4 minutes and 33 seconds to spare. Okay, take this one as well. This one's too complicated. I can just leave it the way it is and achieve the
Okay.
same result. All right, so I want to begin the questioning. And here's my question. So AOL is stuck because of the Affordable Care Act, correct? Healthcare is going to cost it more. But AOL had an option that it did not exercise. And that option, under the Affordable Care Act, would have been to pay the $2,000 employee penalty per employee, as opposed to funding health care, which is astronomically more expensive. And AOL could have said, we're going to do that. We're going to pay the $2,000 penalty, you're on your own. Or we're going to give you a plan that's the equivalent of the bronze plan, which isn't worth the paper it's printed on, because the deductibles could be, and copays can exceed $10,000 a person, which for these parents of the distressed babies might be $10,000 they don't have, assuming that they're not in management and that, they're line workers. So in opting into the Affordable Care Act, didn't the CEO make a decision, and didn't we support that as the board, that was a morally valid decision? And in weighing that decision vis-a-vis pension liability, at the end of the day, whether we're going to fund it, guaranteeing you a fixed amount of money, well, if those are the trade-offs, good health care now versus pensions for those people who last all the years and don't move around, why wasn't the decision that was made morally correct ab initio from the beginning? Or is what's getting your goat the fact that he also wound up getting this very nice parachute for himself?
To address the beginning of your question, I might need you to reiterate the question at the end.
Okay,
again,
that's
just to
fine.
make sure it's all covered.
That's fine.
I think maybe just a point of clarification would be the best thing here, that in his speech, he didn't specifically say that they were opting into the Affordable Care Act. He simply mentioned that there were going to be increased costs associated with the Affordable Care Act, which...
But he's already made a decision to opt in, is my point. So yes, is he politically correct in the way he said these things? That's poor damage control. He needs to fire the head of corporate communications, and hire a coach. Okay,
Yeah.
but in the essence of the issue, why is this decision morally repugnant?
Really, what I think we ended up addressing was the fact that there wasn't anything wrong with his healthcare decision in itself. It was the way that it was addressed. It was the way that it was presented to the employees.
Okay, so then why is form more important than substance? You're elevating the form, an off-the-cuff remark. This is the kind of thing that Bill O'Reilly on one side and Rachel Maddow on the other have field days with every single night on partisan television. But at the heart of it, for the employee stakeholders, and they're not the only stakeholders here,
Yes.
why, other than the fact that, he did it the wrong way, it doesn't look good.
I would argue that there actually is substance to this issue, because there are actually families who are visibly affected by his comments.
Okay, but let me ask you this then. The mother, I found this very telling. The mother went viral. So if we say that Armstrong, said something, even though it's not a HIPAA violation, for sure, who took it viral? By going viral and putting her name on it, she now tells the whole world, I have a quote-unquote distressed baby. Yeah, it's okay, we still have time to go.
Yeah.
So she's the one who's told the world that there's a distressed baby. He didn't announce it, he didn't point to her and say it's because of your baby that we're making this decision, or two others. And isn't it a fact that by having this coverage under the Affordable Care Act, that baby is tremendously more protected, potentially, depending on the disability, than he or she would have been prior to the Affordable Care Act?
I think that to defend the mother for a moment, if you look at the statement that she made, I think that we think as a team, that the motivation for her making the statements that she did was the fact that although Armstrong certainly did not violate HIPAA, as we discussed, but people talk. And people know that within the context of AOL as a company, at least, people that these families worked with at AOL, they knew. And this was something that was so painful for that family to endure, that the not knowing whether their daughter was going to make it through the day every day, that struggle was so personal, something that they had trouble talking to anyone about other than just themselves.
But she didn't have trouble
that
talking
now-
about it virally.
Well, but now it was something that was being brought up at work. It was something that people who were seeing articles written about this speech were then bringing up to her.
Let me ask you a
And she
question.
felt compelled to respond.
How many workers?
to that, in that
How many
sense.
workers does AOL have? Anybody know? Is there a difference? Is there a difference between a company that has, I think, tens of thousands of workers at least?
Yeah.
Okay, where two distressed babies may be statistically a very, minimal number, versus a workplace that has 20 employees. So you get the one distressed baby and everybody knows all the details. And if the CEO says something like that, everyone knows. Every head in the room turns around and says it's her baby. Is there a difference?
I would say that although AOL is a huge company, and we're saying that there is perhaps that disconnect between different sections of the company, not everyone who works at AOL is in the same place. So it was more of a community, that within the community that these families were functioning in AOL, people knew that that was an issue that they had had. It was a deeply personal and painful thing for them to be constantly reminded of, and to have corporate decisions that were going to affect their coworkers in a potentially negative way. To have that blamed on their children when that was still such a recent and deeply painful struggle to have to address, I think I would argue that really, no, there isn't a difference then in that sense between a company of 20 people and a huge company, because they're not functioning in the context of the tens of thousands of employees. They're functioning in the context of the people they see at the water cooler every day.
Daniel?
Sure, thank you. So what is the role of the CEO?
I think, Terry, if you'd like to discuss the leadership management that we're talking
Okay,
about.
well, the CEO is,
I got the
Yeah.
charge. I'm just, what are his specific roles and legal responsibilities, ethical and moral responsibilities to all of the stakeholders?
well, the CEO's job, as a job description, in a broader sense, to manage the company, so to operate as the executive officer, the chief executive officer of the entire company. But I think that we think that we can separate like ethical obligations. Like as far as job description goes, he has to meet a certain requirement for his job description, but that may not allude to specific ethical duties. For example, being transparent as a CEO, you can argue that he was being transparent by describing, this is the reason why we have these high healthcare costs. But is that the ethical course of action to take?
So what are the constraints, and I don't want to get the legal because I'm going to tie this back to the moral issue that you're raising. What are the legal constraints of what the CEO can or cannot make public? Because it's a publicly owned company.
And that would be the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act that
I'm
specifically
talking about
deals.
SEC responsibilities.
We looked at the federal legislation, and I am not currently, I wouldn't know the SEC regulations, to be perfectly honest with you. We looked at it on a federal
So there are
level.
other responsibilities besides the Affordable Care Act, which is a benefit provided by AOL. I'm trying to get to an understanding of why this is so compelling that it would override other legal responsibilities that the CEO has.
When you say legal responsibilities, what do you?
Well, he has certain things he can't talk about. You talked about one of your remedies is to have employee reviews of the CEO, and the CEO to be more transparent of why we're making decisions, what the elements of those decisions were.
Right.
What are the legal constraints from the SEC about a CEO making those kinds of pronouncements?
Well, those certain SEC regulations are, as we've said, aren't something that we are completely familiar with, so I don't think I feel comfortable addressing that specifically. But I think a comment that was made earlier about Tim Armstrong needing to hire a coach is really most of what we were getting at, in that sense that, I mean, it's not expected for a CEO to get in front of his company and divulge everything that's going on. There are certain things that, although the ethical intent and the ethical actions do need to be there, it's not something that's generally expected of a CEO to have a complete level of transparency with his employees. But what we do think is that just the way that he went about presenting the information was obviously not the way that it should have been presented, and that's really what we're arguing, that if he had a more, instead of almost speaking down to his employees and pointing to specific things and not quite specific people, but for those employees who were familiar with their colleagues' situations, pointing to specific people that.
I'm trying to get to
If
Okay.
you don't mind me, I think you're referring to like what kind of sensitive information he will have to disclose to the public because of financial reporting.
Let me just cut to the chase. If he took your model and accepted your model and used the Aristotle virtue line, is that going to make, would that have made a difference in what you're looking at? My concern is that you have taken one thing. Are there any other examples you have? If you have a lot of examples where his behavior didn't match the model that you're suggesting, if there are other things that start to rise to the level of the discussion, and I know for time you picked this one, but the challenge that I have is, to the point made earlier, here's a CEO, from our standpoint as the board, I mean, we're supposed to make sure that the board, that the company is doing all the things complying with law, all of those things, not just the benefits package for the employees. And I think where I'm struggling here is the confusion of your message, the difference between how the employees were made to feel by two as compared to the leveling of all the stakeholders. Because the employees enter into an agreement just like those who buy stock. And I'm trying to sort through how that happens when you take an employment agreement and you say, I agree to these benefits, and you have a choice. You either accept those benefits or you can leave. And my concern is the remedy that you're suggesting here is, we don't want employees to leave, we want the CEO to leave.
I don't think we are suggesting that the CEO should leave. I think that what we're trying to get at specifically the virtue theory is to discuss where he's coming from as a CEO. So we want to make sure he's coming from a virtuous place. You can come from a virtuous place and still fulfill your legal requirements or your requirements to the board of directors. And if you want to pick specific examples, the only specifically alluded to in the presentation would be him choosing to accept these executive compensation packages and change the 401k plan, as well as his comments of the distressed babies. So like those are just indicators of the fact that maybe he's not coming from like the most virtuous place as a CEO.
I'd also like to just take a moment that I don't think that we were saying that Tim Armstrong is a bad CEO or that we think that he should leave the company. We definitely addressed that we think that with the managerial and leadership dichotomy, he's fantastic at managing the operations of the company, and the leadership is where we were having an issue. And addressing the point of us picking the specific case, part of the reason we chose to address this case was because this isn't the first time that this sort of situation has arisen since.
I understand that.
Oh, okay. Yes, that we think that since this sort of issue has happened before with AOL and with Tim Armstrong, it was definitely worth addressing, even though he may be successful in other arenas, the fact that within his addressing of employees, the way that employees perceive him, he will have an easier time getting employees to want to follow him and to believe in his visions for the company if he finds a way to manage having this sort of effect on people and making these sorts of comments in corporate meetings.
So what's the role of all the other leaders between the employee and the CEO, and what's their culpability?
I can't list specifically what their actual job title, like what their actual job description is, but we believe personally that every leader has an obligation to serve their followers and to empower their followers. And what would help with that is to come from a virtuous place. That's where we're alluding to like character instead of just specific plans. Because if the core of your frame, if the core of where you're coming from as a leader is a virtuous place, that tends to mitigate all other problems. So if you're, no matter what your specific job description is within the company, if you're coming from a virtuous place, that will mitigate issues.
Okay.
I have a question on your solution. We're gonna move to that. So one of to the far right slice of the pie was a survey of employees.
Okay.
Right. So I don't understand why we would do that, because Mr. Armstrong is our CEO, and quite frankly, I don't want the most popular guy to be the CEO. He has to make really hard decisions. So why would he subject himself to a regular employee perception survey?
Now, obviously, the best leader is not always going to be the most well-liked leader. And obviously it's important that a CEO be able to make difficult decisions that will be in the best interest of the company, in the best interest of the stakeholders and shareholders in the long run. Those are all things that we're acknowledging. I think though that to a certain extent, personality management and perception management is still an important part of that. That a leader will be most effective when the people who are under him support the decisions that he's making, which these kinds of situations that Tim Armstrong has found himself in, both in this situation and in the past, don't serve that purpose particularly well. So we're not saying that we want, everybody's best friend to step up and be CEO of AOL, but we do think that an important part of him continuing to manage as well as he has would be to have at least some level of employee, at least for the employees to feel like their concerns in to make sure that at least the employee concerns about their CEO are being heard and are having an effect on some level.
You also criticize him for being reactive, and I also don't understand that. His job is to both act and react to situations, so I'm confused as to why that's a... Thanks.
Right. So being reactive isn't always a bad thing. It's important that you're intentional about when you should be reactive. So if you're being asked questions about why your company has a certain amount of cost, and instead of being intentional about how you choose to reveal that information, you blame on distressed babies. That indicates that he maybe is acting from a reactive state, not like an intentionally reactive state, but just a purely reactive state, and that he's choosing to shift the blame. And when someone acts in a purely reactive state, that's usually a bad indicator, because that shows that they're not in control of the situation, and a CEO has to be in control of the situation at all times.
And to that point, don't you think that the problem was this high healthcare cost that was driven by, I'm assuming these are neonatal babies? They're very, very expensive babies. So, I mean, that's a true statement. That's
right.
not...
Yeah, it's a true statement, but we addressed in our presentation that the situation could have been solved if he had a lower cap in the insurance policy. I'm sorry, in the insurance policy. So instead of, he could have presented like this. There were certain healthcare costs that we had as a company that could have been prevented if we had been proactive from the get-go, but instead of choosing to reveal that information, you chose to blame on the distressed babies.
I think Katie might be able to touch on this as well.
Also just Affordable Care Act, the act was not a surprise by any means. All employees or CEOs who are in charge of strategic management should have been anticipating this change. It wasn't like an earthquake hit AOL and they had to pick up the pieces afterwards. So he really should have been able to anticipate the change that was coming through. Like I said, the act was passed on May 23rd of 2010. So here we are. So he has 4 years later.
A result of the Affordable Care Act, I don't think.
No.
Right.
But he says this statement in reaction of that he's going to have all of these much higher costs, but he's saying, I did pay for your babies, I did do this, you know what I mean? I'm your CEO, I tried to help, but yet he could have taken the appropriate steps in installing these caps or in investing in an actual health insurance plan and not his own self-insured plan where he only paid 67 cents per employee for health insurance.
67 cents. Okay, let's not get derailed into finance.
Right. Okay.
All right.
Sorry, that's new information, but that is the stat.
That's all.
And I guess I'll echo the first comment. I wasn't super clear on what was being unethical in the situation. Was it poor form? Absolutely. It's a publicly traded company, so they have some obligation to the stakeholders to hit a certain bottom line. His talent and retaining his talent is going to cost the company. They're going to have to pay him a certain amount to keep him at that level. And you said he's a great manager, so I wasn't super clear. I think from a board perspective, more direct information on, was he doing things legally? Yes, but was it the right thing? No, and here's why.
Is that a question or is
clearing that up a little bit? So
because we only have a minute left.
Okay, sorry.
Question.
Yeah. Okay. In your recommendations, in terms of communication and other, things you wanted to bring, was an ethics officer considered in part of that recommendation?
Was having AOL hire an ethics officer. It wasn't formally considered, but we would definitely recommend that. I mean, But to address your earlier comments about not being clear about what the ethical issue is, I think.
And then ethics officer.
I'll shut it up. You can finish with
The best person to handle this.
Yeah.
Because we were going to.
To allude to your earlier comments, I think the fact of the matter is there were persons in this situation who were disrespected, and those are the parents. And I mean, you can make the argument that it's form over substance, but the fact of the matter is everything comes from a certain place. So if he's coming from this place where he feels defensive or reactive, and then he's doing his job as a CEO, but he's making these comments about his parents and these babies, then that's an ethical issue in itself that we need to address. That the fact that our leadership in our company doesn't have this virtuous, I mean, not to generalize, but we can have more virtuous leadership within the company, is what we're trying to argue and implement in the table.
Okay, thank you. So, we're going to have to do the comments quickly because they have two groups in this room going literally back to back, which usually doesn't happen. Let me just say that the one thing that is stunning to me is these are 3 juniors and a sophomore. You're a sophomore in college.
Just finished my sophomore year.
Just finished your sophomore year. My knee shook when I was a sophomore in college. You know, straight A+ average, but in terms of getting up and having that voice, I didn't get the mouth until much later. So it's always stunning to me to see people at this age level, you know, do exceedingly well in presentation, which is why I push my limits with you like crazy. I think this is an interesting case. I think that it's a very hard case for you to evaluate without having a lot more, 1, financial data available, and 2, yeah, it's a heartbreaker case. You know, they're 2 babies. How many people in AOL have metastatic cancer? How many people in AOL have had kidney transplants or liver transplants, or who are on experimental chemotherapy that is costing the company a fortune, not just in the fact that they're paying for the health insurance, but in leave under the Family Medical Leave Act and all sorts of other ramifications. So in terms of that, and then portraying the CEO as not necessarily being virtuous, you know, I saw a disconnect there. I think that if you're going to get into the business about should CEOs get golden parachutes, well, you know, we've had presentations on that in the competition. I think it kind of diverted from the focus, you know, being where it should have been, to get involved in his level of remuneration. I'm surprised that they reinstituted their original cost of benefits and didn't stand firm, because as Gail was alluding to, they have obligations to people beyond the workers who can pick up and, you know, they're not slaves, they can go to work elsewhere. They have obligations to all the other stakeholders. They have obligations to the shareholders of the company. And not just the fat cat shareholders, but the person who owns 5 shares, you know? And so, you know, I wasn't quite sure that he wasn't virtuous. You know, so he's like, he had the Joe Biden effect. You know, something came out of his mouth that you wanted to pull back right away because it was, you know, unfortunate. But I don't know that that necessarily links to intrinsic failures of virtue on his behalf. I think we could also debate whether going back to that existing plan was unvirtuous too, in a variety of ways. I thought that honestly, and I'm an expert on HIPAA, I thought you should have stayed away from HIPAA. I don't think it enhanced the presentation at all to get into HIPAA, because there was no violation of HIPAA. You know, all you had to say was, notwithstanding the fact that no laws were violated, the question is, what effect did that have? I really thought that Mommy, who went viral on this thing, frankly, you know, doth protest a little too much. Because if you're worried about protecting your family's privacy, sure, everybody in the business unit understands you have a sick kid. And maybe they know that somebody else has psycho kid and somebody else has a mother who's dying. But she chose to put her name out there to the public and then condemns the CEO, who never mentioned her by name. So if you want to talk about virtuous actors here, there's a definite dichotomy here. Having said all of this, this is not an easy competition. It's a tough competition with very complicated issues. I think what you probably realize from Gail's questions is that you do need to know a little bit about the SEC ramifications of an issue, because you can expect that in a group like this, you're going to get asked about it. And I will say to you that at U Florida, you have one major benefit that some of the other schools don't have. You have a great law school on your campus, okay? And I say this with all sincerity because I've given it to other teams for the same reason. If there's a legal issue in this presentation, the last thing I want to hear as a member of a board is, I don't know, or we didn't think about it. Okay, and in real, we know you're young, okay? But it's the last thing. You're my consultant, you're fired, you know? I want you to anticipate everything I'm going to ask you. Or if you don't have an immediate answer, to say, maybe we get back to you and what's your timetable, you know? Because that way you don't look like, oh, I don't know. Why did I hire you, you know? So seriously, be careful of that, because I have seen teams absolutely not take advantage of the resources in their universities, which are, and you have a very deep bench on healthcare at Florida, because that's one of its specialties, and on ERISA and benefits. So I think what you should have done is walked over there and said, can we just run this by you, and do you see any flaws here? Because it can't hurt. And I apologize for what's going on here with this phone thing. Tom will kill me. But $2 million down to $29,000 is a good deal.
Works for me.
My client's happy.
So I would also add that I'd take out the slide on, we're on feedback now, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I would take out the slide on the stock price, because there are so many variables in the stock.
Yeah,
That's
unnecessary.
completely illogical and specious. I mean, makes your presentation go mirror. So I would definitely take that out.
And I would just highlight more, what kind of company does AOL want to be, because that impacts retention and getting the right talent to work there and growth. And don't let the board off so easy. It sets a tone at the top. So we're held accountable for how the public sees AOL. And I think part of the purpose of the mom getting that out is AOL sucks, don't work there. This is how they treat employees, and that's important for us to know.
Which, by the way, may violate just a non-disparagement clause.
Yeah.
I'm sure is in their agreement. You know, it would have been very useful if you had presented yourself as the ethics officers of AOL talking to the board.
Okay.
You know, because you should have known whether they had an ethics officer. That's something that really is easily discoverable. And, you know, I think if you had presented yourselves as the ethics officers, you wouldn't have had to go into HIPAA. You could have said right away, that legal ramification is sort of off the table. Legally, are we obligated to continue our existing pension programs? That's also off the table. You could have taken the legal off the table very, very fast here, you know, and then dealt maybe a little bit more in depth with the financial, the SEC reporting, as a public corporation, et cetera. But it would have been an interesting posture for you to be the ethics officers. Everybody likes to be consultants, right?
Yeah, they do.
They do.
And one more correction on the slide. You talk about healthcare cost being 9.5% of salaries. That's not healthcare cost. Right, healthcare cost is how much you spend on healthcare, but they are actually talking about the contribution they make to the program. So you need to fix that. That's not a fact. That's not actually correct.
And let me just tell you one other thing. Tomorrow, when you present in the 90-second, you're going to be presenting sitting down.
Okay.
On information and beliefs. So whoever understands that they are going to be the presenter, okay, just practice tonight sitting down.
Okay.
Okay, because it's a little different dynamic to be around the table with people rather than to be up at a lecture.
Yeah, I would just tell you that this is the topic that's going around industry all
Like
over the
crazy.
place. I mean, this is a very contemporary topic that will work its way through, and it's a challenge because you're really, you're trying to discern which of the stakeholders are more important than the others, and the workers, the people who actually produce products and services and things like that, are compensated to some level that they agree to or don't agree to. And so there's all kinds of other questions here. The heart of your presentation was about ethical leadership, and you've kind of heard some of the extraneous things that really don't address it. They just don't. They're distractors. They kind of take you away from what you're trying to get to. And are there other models besides the Aristotle's model of what a good leader would be? I mean, I've studied Aristotle, and I just tell you, I haven't heard Aristotle as a role model in corporate leadership ever. So
I agree.
I mean, it's a great model. The golden mean is a great idea for individual behavior and things like that, but taking the golden mean and extrapolating that to what you expect out of corporate leaders with all the dynamics, and I'll leave you one last thought. Good decisions are always made very low. Only the bad decisions are made up high because nobody else can make them. So there's never, ever going to be a good decision made at senior levels. We see it at our national level, our national leaders, we see it at all levels. All of the good decisions are made because they're easy. These are not easy ones, and the reason I brought in the SEC, there are a lot of things that CEO is responsible to do for all of the stakeholders. And just think about retirement plans and how many people have invested in AOL. That there's certainly, I just think you need to look at. Let me also congratulate you. I tell you, your poise in this and your responsiveness and you're quick on your feet. Were you all debaters?
A bit.
Okay, so.
I knew Florida has a great debate.
So understanding that, congratulations, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And since we've got a sophomore and 3 juniors, it means you can come back next year.
Exactly. That's the plan.
Excellent. Cool.
Great, thank you.
Well
It's
done.
fun to see people a couple of years in a row and see how they develop.